Hello everyone. Today we're discussing about the king's geometry. Now, if you don't know how the king moves, he moves one step in any direction he would like. He can go up, down, left, right, or diagonals. Today we're going to look at how the king asserts his dominance towards the end of the game. Alright, so now let's look at our very first position. Looks as if white is in trouble because white is trying to promote, but black king will get to the pawn easily, and it seems like the black pawn is out of reach. But let's see if it actually is. So it's white to move, and white starts by playing king to g7. After playing g7, the black pawn is trying to go to h4 to continue and try and promote. White continues with f6. Now what the king is trying is to be in between both of the pawns to at least try and promote their own or block black from promoting, which would lead to a draw. The next move that we see here is black plays king to b6. Now the reason why king moves here instead of the pawn is because if the h pawn moves blindly, then the king can get to it, and or we will try and promote our own pawn, causing a draw if we have both of the queens on the board. Next we have king e5. Now the reason why we go e5 is because we're either threatening the pawn on the side or we are going to be able to support our own. That's the reason why the king was trying to move in the center all this time, or at least between those two pawns. The next move that black plays has to be either capturing our pawn or trying to promote their own. Let's say they capture our pawn. If they capture our king goes to f4, the pawn will move to h3, our king will get to g3, the pawn will try and promote, but no luck. And just because there are only two kings on the board, this is a draw by insufficient material, and white will be very happy with this position as it looked very difficult for them to promote anyways. Alright, now let's get into position 2. We see that there's no way the white king can go closer to its pawn. It looks like the black king will make it first. We'll get rid of that white pawn and we'll be able to promote. But if white just accepts this fact, there's a lot white could do. Not a lot, but we can get a draw out of this at least. Let's look at it. So we start by king moving to g3, which is weird when you think of it as a beginner because you're moving away from your pawn instead of protecting that. But regardless, this is a well-calculated move. The next move from our opponent is king c2. Just sort of trying to build the barrier to keep our king away just in case we have any plans of going to that pawn on b6. Our king goes far and far away from his own pawn. The king now has made the barrier. There's no way white king can get to its own pawn. White continues doing the same, and so does black. Next, we see that the king is now trying to get closer to our opponent's king. Our opponent's king continues with its goal of getting rid of that white pawn. We get closer. Finally, our opponent gets rid of our pawn. We get closer, and this position is a position where we are going to get a draw. Here, eventually this position is going to lead to a stalemate. Again, another position where we thought that, we've lost the pawn, we'll lose the game. But by just playing a couple of smart moves and accepting the fact that we can't win, looking for the next best solution, which would be a draw, we can still get an appropriate result. Let's look at the third and the last position we have for you today. We have got a very confusing position in front of us. And when you look at this for the first time, it looks like most of the people would play pawn to a6. Pawn to a6 would be incorrect as white will just end up losing that pawn and then black will end up promoting their own. So now what is to be done? White will actually play c8. Now again, white cannot get closer to its own pawn, and the reason why it gets closer or tries to go away from our opponent's pawn for now is to not provoke that pawn just yet. Alright, next, black continues. Black really wants to take our pawn, so it moves closer to us. White continues with the next best square, and black does the same. Now black is on the verge of capturing our pawn. white just takes a step forward. This forces black to take our pawn. If black were to not take our pawn right now, we will be able to promote this pawn with the support of the king. So now black goes on to capture our pawn, and with king to b7, our last move, we've made it just in time to catch the pawn if it tries to promote. Let's see this happening. King to c6, pawn to h5, trying to promote. King gets closer with d5, pawn tries to promote with h4, getting closer to promotion. King goes to e4, pawn to h3, king to f3, pawn to h2, king to g2, pawn finally promotes on h1, and the king captures the promoted pawn. I hope you got to learn a little more about the king today. As you could probably understand today, the king moves at the same pace diagonally or in a straight line. So that's something that we need to make sure we can take advantage of. If you can't get a win, get a draw. Better than losing. I hope we were able to give you something new and valuable today and hope to see you around. Take care. Thanks for watching.